Book 2, Chapter 19 of Resurrection. The man on whom depended the easing of the fate of the Petersburg prisoners was an old general of repute, a baron of German descent who, as it was said of him, had outlived his wits. He had received a profusion of orders, but only wore one of them, the Order of the White Cross. He had received this order, which he greatly valued, while serving in the Caucasus, because a number of Russian peasants, with their hair cropped and dressed in uniform and armed with guns and bayonets, had killed, at his command, more than 1,000 men who were defending their liberty, their homes, and their families. Later on he served in Poland, and there also made Russian peasants commit many different crimes, and got more orders and decorations for his uniform. Then he served somewhere else, and now that he was a weak old man he had this position, which ensured him a good house, an income, and respect. He strictly observed all the regulations which were prescribed from above, and was very zealous in the fulfilment of these regulations, to which he ascribed a special importance, considering that everything else in the world might be changed, except the regulations prescribed from above. His duty was to keep political prisoners, men and women, in solitary confinement in such a way that half of them perished in 10 years' time, some going out of their minds, some dying of consumption, some committing suicide by starving themselves to death, cutting their veins with bits of glass, hanging or burning themselves to death. The old general was not ignorant of this. It all happened within his knowledge, but these cases no more touched his conscience than accidents brought on by thunderstorms, floods, etc. These cases occurred as a consequence of the fulfilment of regulations prescribed from above by His Imperial Majesty. These regulations had to be carried out without fail, and therefore it was absolutely useless to think of the consequences of their fulfilment. The old general did not even allow himself to think of such things, counting it his patriotic duty as a soldier not to think of them, for fear of getting weak in the carrying out of these, according to his opinion, very important obligations. Once a week the old general made the round of the cells, one of the duties of his position, and asked the prisoners if they had any requests to make. The prisoners had all sorts of requests. He listened to them quietly, in impenetrable silence, and never fulfilled any of their requests, because they were all in disaccord with the regulations. Just as Nekhludoff drove up to the old general's house, the high notes of the bells on the belfry clock chimed "Great is the Lord," and then struck 2. The sound of these chimes brought back to Nekhludoff's mind what he had read in the notes of the Decembrists. The Decembrists were a group who attempted, but failed, to put an end to absolutism in Russia at the time of the accession of Nicholas I. About the way this sweet music repeated every hour re-echoes in the hearts of those imprisoned for life. Meanwhile the old general was sitting in his darkened drawing-room at an inlaid table, turning a saucer on a piece of paper with the aid of a young artist, the brother of one of his subordinates. The thin, weak, moist fingers of the artist were pressed against the wrinkled and stiff-jointed fingers of the old general, and the hands, joined in this manner, were moving together with the saucer over a paper that had all the letters of the alphabet written on it. The saucer was answering the questions put by the general as to how souls will recognize each other after death. When Nekhludoff sent in his card by an orderly acting as footman, the soul of Joan of Arc was speaking by the aid of the saucer. The soul of Joan of Arc had already spelt, letter by letter, the words, "They well knew each other," and these words had been written down. When the orderly came in, the saucer had stopped first on B, then on Y, and began jerking hither and thither. This jerking was caused by the general's opinion that the next letter should be B, i.e., Joan of Arc ought to say that the souls will know each other by being cleansed of all that is earthly, or something of the kind, clashing with the opinion of the artist, who thought the next letter should be L, i.e., that the souls should know each other by light emanating from their astral bodies. The General, with his bushy grey eyebrows gravely contracted, sat gazing at the hands on the saucer and, imagining that it was moving of its own accord, kept pulling the saucer towards B. The pale-faced young artist, with his thin hair combed back behind his ears, was looking with his lifeless blue eyes into a dark corner of the drawing-room, nervously moving his lips and pulling the saucer towards L. The General made a wry face at the interruption, but after a moment's pause he took the card, put on his pince-nez, and uttering a groan, rose, in spite of the pain in his back, to his full height, rubbing his numb fingers. "Ask him into the study." "With your Excellency's permission, I will finish it alone," said the artist, rising. "I feel the presence." "All right, finish alone," the General said, severely and decidedly, and stepped quickly, with big, firm, and measured strides, into his study. "Very pleased to see you," said the General to Nekhludoff, uttering the friendly words in a gruff tone, and pointing to an armchair by the side of the writing-table. "Have you been in Petersburg long?" Nekhludoff replied that he had only lately arrived. "Is the Princess, your mother, well?" "My mother is dead." "Forgive me, I am very sorry. My son told me he had met you." The General's son was making the same kind of career for himself that the father had done, and, having passed the military academy, was now serving in the inquiry office, and was very proud of his duties there. His occupation was the management of government spies. "Why, I served with your father. We were friends, comrades. And you, are you also in the service?" "No, I am not." The General bent his head disapprovingly. "I have a request to make, General." "Very pleased. In what way can I be of service to you?" "If my request is out of place, pray pardon me, but I am obliged to make it." "What is it?" "There is a certain Gourkevitch imprisoned in the fortress. His mother asks for an interview with him, or at least to be allowed to send him some books." The General expressed neither satisfaction nor dissatisfaction at Nekhludoff's request, but bending his head on one side, he closed his eyes as if considering. In reality he was not considering anything, and was not even interested in Nekhludoff's questions, well knowing that he would answer them according to the law. He was simply resting mentally, and not thinking at all. "You see," he said at last, "this does not depend on me. There is a regulation, confirmed by His Majesty, confirming interviews. And as to books, we have a library, and they may have what is permitted." "Yes, but he wants scientific books. He wishes to study." "Don't you believe it," growled the General. "It's not study he wants. It is just only restlessness." "But what is to be done? They must occupy their time somehow in their hard condition," said Nekhludoff. "They are always complaining," said the General. "We know them." He spoke of them in a general way, as if they were all a specially bad race of men. "They have conveniences here which can be found in few places of confinement," said the General, and he began to enumerate the comforts the prisoners enjoyed, as if the aim of the institution was to give the people imprisoned there a comfortable home. "It is true it used to be rather rough, but now they are very well kept here," he continued. "They have 3 courses for dinner, and one of them meat, cutlets or rissoles, and on Sundays they get a 4th, a sweet dish. God grant every Russian may eat as well as they do." Like all old people, the General, having once got on to a familiar topic, enumerated the various proofs he had often given before of the prisoners being exacting and ungrateful. "They get books on spiritual subjects and old journals. We have a library, only they rarely read. At first they seem interested. Later on the new books remain uncut, and the old ones with their leaves unturned. We tried them," said the old General, with a dim likeness of a smile. "We put bits of paper in on purpose, which remained just as they had been placed. Writing is also not forbidden," he continued. "A slate is provided, and a slate pencil, so that they can write as a pastime. They can wipe the slate and write again, but they don't write either. Oh, they very soon get quite tranquil. At first they seem restless, but later on they even grow fat and become very quiet." Thus spoke the General, never suspecting the terrible meaning of his words. Nekhludoff listened to the hoarse old voice, looked at the stiff limbs, the swollen eyelids under the grey brows, at the old, clean-shaved, flabby jaw supported by the collar of the military uniform, at the white cross that this man was so proud of, chiefly because he had gained it by exceptionally cruel and extensive slaughter, and knew that it was useless to reply to the old man or to explain the meaning of his own words to him. He made another effort, and asked about the prisoner Shoustova, for whose release, as he had been informed that morning, orders were given. "Shoustova? Shoustova? I cannot remember all their names. There are so many of them," he said, as if reproaching them because there were so many. He rang and ordered the secretary to be called. While waiting for the latter, he began persuading Nekhludoff to serve, saying that honest noblemen, counting himself among the number, were particularly needed by the Tsar and the country, he added, evidently only to round off his sentence. "I am old, yet I am serving still, as well as my strength allows." The secretary, a dry, emaciated man, with restless, intelligent eyes, came in and reported that Shoustova was imprisoned in some queer, fortified place, and that he had received no orders concerning her. "When we get the order we shall let her out the same day. We do not keep them. We do not value their visits much," said the General, with another attempt at a playful smile, which only distorted his old face. Nekhludoff rose, trying to keep from expressing the mixed feelings of repugnance and pity which he felt towards this terrible old man. The old man, on his part, considered that he should not be too severe on the thoughtless and evidently misguided son of his old comrade, and should not leave him without advice. "Good-bye, my dear fellow. Do not take it amiss. It is my affection that makes me say it. Do not keep company with such people as we have at our place here. There are no innocent ones among them. All these people are most immoral. We know them," he said, in a tone that admitted no possibility of doubt. And he did not doubt, not because the thing was so, but because, if it was not so, he would have to admit himself to be not a noble hero living out the last days of a good life, but a scoundrel who sold, and still continued in his old age to sell, his conscience. "Best of all, go and serve," he continued. "The Tsar needs honest men, and the country," he added. "Well, supposing I and the others refuse to serve as you are doing, who would be left? Here we are finding fault with the order of things, and yet not wishing to help the government." With a deep sigh Nekhludoff made a low bow, shook the large, bony hand condescendingly stretched out to him, and left the room. The General shook his head reprovingly, and rubbing his back, he again went into the drawing-room where the artist was waiting for him. He had already written down the answer given by the soul of Joan of Arc. The General put on his pince-nez and read, "Will know one another by light emanating from their astral bodies." "Ah," said the General, with approval, and closed his eyes. "But how is one to know if the light of all is alike?" he asked, and again crossed fingers with the artist on the saucer. The izvozchik drove Nekhludoff out of the gate. "It is dull here, sir," he said. turning to Nekhludoff. "I almost wished to drive off without waiting for you." Nekhludoff agreed. "Yes, it is dull," and he took a deep breath and looked up with a sense of relief at the grey clouds that were floating in the sky and at the glistening ripples made by the boats and steamers on the Neva. End of Book 2, Chapter 19. Book 2, Chapter 20 of Resurrection. The next day Maslova's case was to be examined at the Senate, and Nekhludoff and the advocate met at the majestic portal of the building, where several carriages were waiting. Ascending the magnificent and imposing staircase to the first floor, the advocate, who knew all the ins and outs of the place, turned to the left and entered through a door which had the date of the introduction of the Code of Laws above it. After taking off his overcoat in the first narrow room, he found out from the attendant that the senators had all arrived, and that the last had just come in. Fanarin, in his swallow-tail coat, a white tie above the white shirt front, and a self-confident smile on his lips, passed into the next room. In this room there were to the right a large cupboard and a table, and to the left a winding staircase, which an elegant official in uniform was descending with a portfolio under his arm. In this room an old man, with long white hair and a patriarchal appearance, attracted everyone's attention. He wore a short coat and grey trousers. Two attendants stood respectfully beside him. The old man with white hair entered the cupboard and shut himself in. Fanarin noticed a fellow advocate dressed in the same way as himself, with a white tie and dress coat, and at once entered into an animated conversation with him. Nekhludoff was meanwhile examining the people in the room. The public consisted of about 15 persons, of whom 2 were ladies, a young one with a pince-nez, and an old grey-haired one. A case of libel was to be heard that day, and therefore the public were more numerous than usual, chiefly persons belonging to the journalistic world. The usher, a red-cheeked, handsome man in a fine uniform, came up to Fanarin and asked him what his business was. When he heard that it was the case of Maslova, he noted something down and walked away. Then the cupboard door opened, and the old man with the patriarchal appearance stepped out, no longer in a short coat, but in a gold-trimmed attire which made him look like a bird, and with metal plates on his breast. This funny costume seemed to make the old man himself feel uncomfortable, and, walking faster than his wont, he hurried out of the door opposite the entrance. "That is Bay, a most estimable man," Fanarin said to Nekhludoff, and then, having introduced him to his colleague, he explained the case that was about to be heard, which he considered very interesting. The hearing of the case soon commenced, and Nekhludoff, with the public, entered the left side of the Senate chamber. They all, including Fanarin, took their places behind a grating. Only the Petersburg advocate went up to a desk in front of the grating. The Senate chamber was not so big as the criminal court, and was more simply furnished. Only the table in front of the senators was covered with crimson, gold-trimmed velvet instead of green cloth, but the attributes of all places of judgment, i.e. the mirror of justice, the icon, the emblem of hypocrisy, and the emperor's portrait, the emblem of servility, were there. The usher announced in the same solemn manner, "The court is coming." Everyone rose in the same way, and the senators entered in their uniforms and sat down on high-backed chairs and leant on the table, trying to appear natural, just in the same way as the judges in the court of law. There were 4 senators present: Nikitin, who took the chair, a clean-shaved man with a narrow face and steely eyes; Wolf, with significantly compressed lips and little white hands, with which he kept turning over the pages of the business papers; Skovorodnikov, a heavy, fat, pock-marked man, the learned lawyer; and Bay, the patriarchal-looking man who had arrived last. With the advocates entered the chief secretary and public prosecutor, a lean, clean-shaven young man of medium height, a very dark complexion, and sad black eyes. Nekhludoff knew him at once, in spite of his curious uniform and the fact that he had not seen him for 6 years. He had been one of his best friends in Nekhludoff's student days. "The public prosecutor, Selenin?" Nekhludoff asked, turning to the advocate. "Yes. Why?" "I know him well. He is a fine fellow." "And a good public prosecutor, businesslike. Now he is the man you should have interested." "He will act according to his conscience in any case," said Nekhludoff, recalling the intimate relations and friendship between himself and Selenin, and the attractive qualities of the latter. Purity, honesty, and good breeding in its best sense. "Yes, there is no time now," whispered Fanarin, who was listening to the report of the case that had commenced. The Court of Justice was accused of having left a decision of the Court of Law unaltered. Nekhludoff listened and tried to make out the meaning of what was going on, but, just as in the criminal court, his chief difficulty was that not the evidently chief point, but some side issues were being discussed. The case was that of a newspaper which had published the account of a swindle arranged by a director of a limited liability company. It seemed that the only important question was whether the director of the company really abused his trust, and how to stop him from doing it. But the questions under consideration were whether the editor had a right to publish this article of his contributor, and what he had been guilty of in publishing it, slander or libel, and in what way slander included libel, or libel included slander, and something rather incomprehensible to ordinary people about all sorts of statutes and resolutions passed by some general department. The only thing clear to Nekhludoff was that, in spite of what Wolf had so strenuously insisted on the day before, i.e., that the Senate could not try a case on its merits, in this case he was evidently strongly in favour of repealing the decision of the Court of Justice, and that Selenin, in spite of his characteristic reticence, stated the opposite opinion with quite unexpected warmth. The warmth, which surprised Nekhludoff, evinced by the usually self-controlled Selenin, was due to his knowledge of the director's shabbiness in money matters, and the fact, which had accidentally come to his ears, that Wolf had been to a swell dinner party at the swindler's house only a few days before. Now that Wolf spoke on the case, guardedly enough, but with evident bias, Selenin became excited and expressed his opinion with too much nervous irritation for an ordinary business transaction. It was clear that Selenin's speech had offended Wolf. He grew red, moved in his chair, made silent gestures of surprise, and at last rose with a very dignified and injured look, together with the other senators, and went out into the debating room. "What particular case have you come about?" the usher asked again, addressing Fanarin. "I have already told you, Maslova's case." "Yes, quite so. It is to be heard today, but—" "But what?" the advocate asked. "Well, you see, this case was to be examined without taking sides, so that the senators will hardly come out again after passing the resolution. But I will inform them." "What do you mean?" I'll inform them, and the usher again put something down on his paper. The senators really meant to pronounce their decision concerning the libel case, and then to finish the other business, Maslova's case among it, over their tea and cigarettes, without leaving the debating room. End of Book 2, Chapter 20.